In 2014, Bellator made one of the boldest moves in their history, signing a 17-year-old kid to a multi-year professional MMA contract. He had no fights under his belt, and he had absolutely zero professional experience. Worse still, he wouldn't step foot in a Bellator cage for 3 years. What could have persuaded Scott Coker to invest multiple years of salary into a 17-year-old kid? Well, this was no ordinary 17-year-old. He was Aaron Pico, an MMA prospect that many thought would change the game forever.
It's like watching lightning, you know? It's so impressive because
he's got some skills, man. This guy is really dangerous.
And the amount of firepower he has and the skill he has standing up.
Presenting Aaron Pico.
Aaron Pico was an undefeated high school wrestling champion and a world-traveling grappler funded by the US Olympic wrestling team, who believed he would one day deliver them Olympic gold. But Pico wasn't just a wrestling prodigy. He was also a national Golden Gloves boxing champion by the age of 13 and had twice been honored nationally as the most outstanding boxer for his age group. Aaron Pico was a prodigy unlike anything MMA had seen to this point, molded from the age of 4 into a fighting machine with elite skills in multiple core mixed martial arts. He was built for MMA, and he wasn't just expected to succeed, he was expected to dominate and rewrite the MMA record books.
Are you interested in bringing him into the featherweight division?
I don't know. I'll talk to the boys.
Another one is Aaron Pico.
I definitely know the boys are interested in him.
But how did the career of MMA's greatest ever prospect actually play out? In this video, we break down the meteoric rise and rocky road of the most hyped prospect in MMA history. Let's get into the video. For most fighters in MMA, the journey begins with early specialization in a single martial art, be it wrestling, jiu-jitsu, or a striking discipline, before making the transition into MMA later and picking up other disciplines to round out their martial arts skill set. Given the sport's relative infancy, it was rare to see athletes who focused on mastering multiple martial arts from a young age. Built for MMA prospects just did not really exist. But Aaron Pico was on a completely different path to the fighters who had come before him, with a skill set so brilliant it felt like he'd been created in a lab specifically to dominate in mixed martial arts. Pico's journey to mixed martial arts began at the age of just 4 when he was introduced to wrestling for the first time, and by the age of 6 he was already competing in national tournaments. His dad, seeing his son's natural potential, would do everything he could to harness it, even going as far to arrange meetups with other dads to let Pico wrestle older and heavier kids. At the age of 9, Pico would decide to try out boxing, and unbelievably, he was just as gifted in that sport as he was in wrestling, becoming a national level prospect in both sports. By the time Aaron Pico entered high school, his potential was undeniable. He went 42-0 in wrestling and cruised to the state championship in California in what is one of the toughest circuits in high school wrestling. He combined this domination with boxing excellence, winning national acclaim for his performances, including the coveted Golden Gloves National Championship. But rather than follow up this excellent freshman year with more championships, Pico would instead make the wild decision to drop out of school before his sophomore year and devote 100% of his time to getting even better at martial arts. Rather than sitting in the classroom, Pico was flying around the world and honing his craft, winning championships in freestyle, folklore, and Greco-Roman wrestling, with his traveling all funded by the US Olympic wrestling team, who had sat up and taken notice of a potential future medal-winning prospect. But talent alone wasn't what set Pico apart from his peers. It was also his mentality. He trained like a man possessed despite his young age. Work ethic strong enough that Valentin Kalika, one of the most respected wrestling coaches in Eastern Europe, offered to train him twice a day, every day, for free, wanting to play his part in helping deliver an Olympic gold medal. With his mentality packaged together with the wrestling and boxing excellence, Pico was an absolutely frightening MMA prospect, unlike anything seen in the sport to date. He was a unicorn with a ceiling high enough to potentially change the sport of MMA forever. And soon, the industry started to take notice, with Pico's name beginning to echo in gyms, back channels, and online forums as one to watch for the future. And eventually, as Pico progressed through his teenage years, that name would make it to one of the most powerful men in the sport, Bellator president Scott Coker. In 2014, Scott Coker received a call from veteran MMA manager Bob Cook, a trusted talent scout who'd shown a knack for discovering future MMA stars. Over the years, Cook had helped to unearth some of MMA's brightest prospects, including a young Daniel Cormier, helping Scott Coker to shape the rosters of both Strikeforce and now Bellator. Needless to say, when Bob Cook called, Scott Coker would definitely answer. But this time, before Coker could even say hello, Cook couldn't contain his excitement and announced to Coker, "I've got him. I've got the next kid." But that excitement quickly turned to frustration for Coker. The kid Cook was raving about was just 17, and even worse, he wasn't even thinking about MMA yet, instead focusing on wrestling with a view to one day competing at the Olympics for the USA. And yet once Scott Coker heard the full story of Aaron Pico's background, his elite wrestling credentials, and his national level boxing success, Coker would make an unprecedented decision. He offered Pico a multi-year developmental contract that would pay him a monthly salary immediately, even though the 17-year-old wouldn't be making his Bellator debut for years. The potential of this kid was just too high for Coker to risk waiting around and missing out on an MMA prospect he believed was once in a generation. And Bellator were not alone in buying into the Aaron Pico hype at an early stage, with Nike also deciding to sign Pico to a long-term deal, making him one of the only MMA fighters to ever be sponsored by Nike, along with the likes of Anderson Silva and John Jones. Special company for a guy yet to even make his MMA debut. But the deals with Nike and Bellator did come with a catch. By accepting sponsorship and salary, the NCAA did not recognize Pico as an amateur, and he became ineligible to compete in college wrestling, a route many top MMA fighters had taken before him. For now, his sights were set firmly on making the US Olympic wrestling team, and he was determined to focus everything on that goal. For the next couple of years, Pico focused on his wrestling training with history in his sights, aiming to become the first teenager in over 30 years to make the US Olympic wrestling team. To aid these efforts, he took part in several international tournaments and scored notable wins over seasoned competitors despite his young age. With the 2016 Rio Olympics on the horizon, Pico entered the US Olympic team trials in the stacked 65 kg bracket, making his way impressively through the bracket by beating guys like two-time NCAA champion Jordan Oliver and three-time US national champion Reese Humphrey. But in the finals, with an Olympic dream on the line, Pico would come up just short, losing by the narrowest of margins to Frank Molinaro, a gritty former NCAA champion, ending his bid to represent the US in Rio. It was a heartbreaking result, but Pico's performance had confirmed what many already believed. He was the real deal, and he had come so very close to being the first teenager to rep the US at the Olympics in wrestling for more than 3 decades. But with that dream now behind him, it was time to turn the page. Pico would step away from wrestling and finally begin the journey that many had been waiting for, his transition into professional MMA. And with his pedigree, his mentality, and the years of anticipation behind him, many believed Pico's MMA career wasn't just going to be great, it was going to be one of the best ever. Despite the astronomical hype surrounding Aaron Pico and the significant investment Bellator had made in him, there was no rush to throw him straight into the cage. Pico spent almost 2 years after his Olympic heartbreak fully immersed in MMA training. The goal was clear. When he finally made that walk to the cage, he wouldn't just be ready to compete, he'd be ready to dominate. Some speculated whether the pressure might prove to be too much for such a young guy to handle. But if Pico felt the weight of expectation, he didn't show it. At least publicly, he seemed unfazed by the attention. In fact, he leaned into it, openly trash-talking fighters who were irritated by the spotlight being shone on a kid with no pro fights. In the summer of 2017, with Aaron Pico now 20 years old, Bellator was finally ready to launch what they hoped would be a new era in MMA. The beginning of an all-time great career would take place at an all-time great venue, with Pico's debut coming on the main card of Bellator 180 held at Madison Square Garden. His opponent was 33-year-old Zach Freeman, a tough, seasoned fighter with an 8-2 record. Whilst Freeman had the clear edge in experience, he was viewed as a manageable test and the first stepping stone on Pico's long road to greatness. As the 20-year-old stood inside the cage on fight night staring across at his opponent, it was hard not to wonder what was running through his mind. After years of build-up, training, and expectation, and with the weight of Bellator's hopes on his shoulders, the adrenaline, nerves, and pressure must have been absolutely huge. As the bell sounded and the fight began, Pico immediately went after Freeman, eager to not just win, but win early and in style. But just 10 seconds in, things went horribly wrong. Pico swung for the fences, leaving his chin exposed for a Freeman counter that dropped him, stunning the crowd. Freeman immediately pounced on him, locking in a guillotine choke, and in just 24 seconds, the fight was done. MMA's greatest ever prospect had tapped out and lost his first ever fight in a devastating blow to not just Pico, but also Bellator, with the years of investment and preparation put into him going up in smoke. The look on Pico's face as Freeman celebrated was one of disbelief. This simply was not supposed to happen. But as terrible as losing your first fight is, it's not a death sentence in MMA, and several great fighters have bounced back after losing in their debut. Questions were asked about Bellator and Scott Coker's matchmaking and whether Bellator should have built Pico up slowly. But now, the focus was on rebuilding from this setback as the critics began to sharpen their knives. Was this loss just a stumble, or had the hype behind Pico been misplaced all along? Less than 4 months later, he was back, this time in a lower weight class and far from the bright lights of MSG. This fight also happened to be on Pico's 21st birthday, and he got the gift he was after with a violent highlight reel performance. Eager to remind everyone of why he'd been so hyped, Pico delivered another ultra-aggressive display that flashed both his wrestling and striking prowess, with Pico absolutely unloading with strikes in round 1 before getting a savage highlight reel left hook walk-off knockout. This was the guy we'd been promised, and Pico was quick to let the doubters know he was in this game for the long haul and he had his sights firmly set on becoming a champion. Seemingly having learnt from the trauma of Pico's debut, Bellator continued to feed him manageable opponents where he was considered by oddsmakers to be a massive favourite despite his inexperience. And Pico continued delivering both the wins and the highlights, with his ultra-aggressive style providing another savage left hook, this time to the body, to finish Shane Crutchin in just over 30 seconds. This win was followed by a finish over Lee Morrison in just over 1 minute, putting Pico's professional record at 3 wins and 1 defeat, slowly building back confidence that Pico was as good as he had been advertised. With momentum now back on their side, Bellator decided it was time to raise the stakes, matching up Pico against Leandro Higo, an experienced 18-4 fighter who was expected to give Pico a tough night at the office. But Pico passed this test with flying colors, dominating the fight on the front foot, dropping Higo twice and then getting the finish all in the first round. It was his 4th first-round finish in a row, and with it, he'd flipped the narrative around him completely. Just over a year removed from his disastrous debut, Pico had re-established himself as one of the most dangerous rising contenders in MMA, and the hype was starting to mount all over again. Bellator's confidence in their prized asset was now sky high, and they were ready to push him to the moon as their homegrown American gem, who practically guaranteed must-watch action every minute he was in the cage thanks to his insane aggression. Pico had debuted in the iconic MSG, and his next fight would be on another marquee Bellator card, held in his home state of California at the Forum as the co-main event of a card headlined by Fedor Emelianenko versus Ryan Bader. His opponent in Henry Corrales was a battle-tested veteran touting a 16-3 record and bringing with him to the fight a 4-fight win streak. This was on paper the best fighter Pico had ever fought, and yet the belief in Pico had been restored to such an extent that the odds makers had him as a monumental favourite to win the fight. Once Pico got Corrales out of the way, it was expected that Scott Coker would greenlight his path to a title shot, having invested years into Pico's development and being eager to cash in as soon as possible. But in MMA, plans can be torn to shreds at a moment's notice. Even with his toughest challenge yet in front of him, Pico went about his business in the exact same way he had in his previous fights, immediately applying pressure and looking like he'd deliver yet another first-round knockout as he dropped Corrales with a vicious uppercut. But the wily veteran Corrales didn't panic. He weathered the early storm, kept his composure, and he made Pico pay for his reckless aggression, timing a vicious counter right hand that shut Pico's lights out and ended the fight in an instant, stunning the crowd who thought they were watching Pico's procession to a shot at the featherweight title. It was a violent and dramatic end that brought to the fore the brutal reality of MMA, where dreams can turn into nightmares from just one punch. Just like that, Pico's momentum was completely gone. The comeback narrative, the title talk, had all been shattered by one perfectly timed punch. And with both of his career losses coming by way of first-round finishes, each caused by his own over-aggression, the questions began to pile up. Was Pico's chin a liability? Was his style just too reckless? And was he actually the generational talent that we'd been promised? Pico had all of the natural talent in the world, but he was seemingly lacking fight IQ, and his lack of experience had been brutally exposed twice in his first 6 fights, an indication that he was still far from reaching the levels of greatness that had been projected upon him as a teenager. After the devastating loss to Corrales, Pico found himself at a pivotal crossroads. With a record of 4-2, the dream of fast-tracking to a title shot had been derailed, and it was clear something had to change. Rather than dwell on the defeat, Pico took action. Just weeks after the loss, he packed his bags, left his home in California, and moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico, to join the renowned Jackson Wink MMA Academy, the longtime training home of legends like John Jones and Andrei Arlovsky. The rationale was simple. As Pico later admitted in interviews, he had the raw talent, but he hadn't quite yet learned how to fight smart, and he believed that the high-level coaching and disciplined environment of Jackson Wink might be the missing piece of the puzzle to help unlock his full potential as an MMA fighter. It was a humbling step, but one that showed maturity and a willingness to evolve, even if it meant leaving his comfort zone behind. We would only have to wait 5 months before seeing Pico back in the cage, but this time Bellator had no interest in building Pico back up slowly, and he was thrown into another tough fight against rising star Adam Boric, who was undefeated at 12-0. Despite the fact Pico had only been training at Jackson Wink for 5 months, we saw significant changes to his fighting style, as he displayed more patience and more wrestling than we had seen from his first 6 fights. We would also see a Pico fight make it to the second round for the first time in his career, with Pico grappling his way into edging the first round. This was a promising start, and Pico followed it up in the second round by again controlling the action with his wrestling. It was a very promising performance, and a sign that the move to Jackson Wink was paying off, until suddenly it wasn't. With just a minute left in the second round, Boric managed to scramble back to his feet, and as Pico came forward, Boric unleashed a devastatingly perfectly timed flying knee, a highlight reel strike that landed flush and knocked Pico out cold. To make matters worse, this loss occurred at MSG, the same venue where Pico's debut had unraveled 2 years earlier. It was a cruel twist of fate and a symbolic full circle that left Pico right back where he started, only now with another crushing defeat and even more questions about whether the once-in-a-generation prospect was actually special at all. The reaction to this fight was tough, with many officially declaring the hype and projections of titles as dead in the water, with Pico's record sitting at 4 wins and 3 defeats. And these defeats had occurred in definitive and undeniable fashion, rather than close fights decided on the scorecards. He had been expected to redefine the sport before he'd even taken his first steps into it, and ultimately, anyone who thought he was going to immediately take over and dominate had been proven incorrect. In the inquest of where things went wrong for Pico, it's not just a case of he wasn't good enough. His coaching environment from an MMA perspective in the first years of his MMA career seemingly failed to deliver in helping him string together the elite martial arts credentials he was bringing to the cage into a winning fighting formula. He'd also been done absolutely no favors by Bellator, who had been intent on throwing him into the deep end at any and every opportunity, despite the fact he'd come into the promotion with no MMA fight experience. After losing in round 1 to Corrales in his 6th ever fight, his reward was being thrown in with 12-0 Adam Boric rather than any attempt at a proper rebuild. You can argue, given the hype, that he shouldn't have needed to be built up, but it would have been smart business given Pico himself has admitted he still needed to learn how to fight properly in the aftermath of the Corrales loss. But while he may not have lived up to the hype of being the LeBron James of MMA, he was still only 22 years of age, and while it was likely impossible he'd ever reach GOAT status, there was more than enough time for a career revival. Most fighters his age hadn't even cracked the roster of a major promotion, let alone been a part of huge cards and fought at MSG. But in the face of such crushing disappointment, did Pico have it in him to get back up and keep going? What happened to Aaron Pico in the time since the June 2019 loss to Adam Boric? Following the loss to Boric, Pico took several months away from competition, time that he used to reset, reflect, and further sharpen his game. Rather than rushing back, he focused on continuing to evolve, determined to round out his skill set and rebuild properly this time. By early 2020, he was ready to return, and he was matched up against Daniel Carey, and Pico showed clear progress under the guidance of Jackson Wing, demonstrating the kind of patience, composure, and maturity that had been missing in the early chapters of his career, where his style was dominated by uncontrolled aggression. Though Carey survived the first round, Pico would end the fight just 15 seconds into round 2 with a vicious left hook, the kind of strike that reminded everyone of his raw power and striking ability. It was arguably the most complete performance of his career so far, a smart, well-rounded display that combined his elite wrestling, sharp striking, and a growing fight IQ. And from this point, with his record now at 5-3, a rejuvenated Pico would go on a tear, racking up win after win. He'd get his first submission win in his next fight and rounded out his 2020 with a stoppage win over John DeJesus in extremely dominant fashion. Another submission win followed to put Pico's record at 8 wins and 3 defeats, and in his next fight we saw another first in the story of Aaron Pico as he was taken to the judges' scorecards for the first time in his career against unbeaten Justin Gonzalez, with the judges scoring Pico the clear winner, taking him to 9-3 and showing the progression he'd made from his days as a hyper-aggressive brawler. It seemed like a curse at this point, but with a 5-fight win streak and his clearly improving fight IQ, the hype was beginning to find Pico again, though it was somewhat muted compared to the levels of hype we'd seen before. Bellator, for their part, still believed in him too, and they hadn't given up on their boy wonder, signing him to a multi-fight, multi-year contract extension, a clear vote of confidence in his evolution and his future potential. His next fight was booked against James Kennedy in a fight expected to test Pico significantly, but Kennedy would be forced to pull out after breaking his orbital, which forced Bellator to arrange a short-notice fight against Adley Edwards instead. Pico justified his new contract with an amazing display against his outmatched opponent, with savage boxing and strong wrestling alongside smarter management of the fight, allowing him to completely and utterly dominate his way to a win. Sitting now at age 25 with a 10-3 record and a 6-fight win streak, the time was right for Pico to push onwards and compete again against the upper echelons of the division and see if he was finally ready for it. Bellator opted to rebook the fight against the 17-3 James Kennedy, with the bookies favoring Pico as a huge favorite to overcome Kennedy and announce himself as a title contender. After all the setbacks, all the struggle, and all the doubt that had followed Pico from early on in his MMA career, was this the moment he rose above it all? Tragically, no it wasn't. And while Pico avoided losing by devastating knockout this time, this loss was perhaps the most frustrating of his career, because honestly, it wasn't his fault. In a grappling exchange in the clinch, Pico's shoulder unfortunately dislocated, and despite Pico's best efforts to pop it back in mid-fight, as well as his corner's attempts at popping it back in once the round ended, his shoulder was still badly messed up, leading the doctor to make the call to stop the fight and declare Kennedy the winner. It was a gutting result. After all the progress Pico had made, the refinement of his skill set, the maturity in his game, his comeback had been derailed by a freak injury rather than a mistake of his own. And once again, the dream of becoming one of MMA's greats slipped just a bit further out of reach. But much like his reaction to his earlier losses, Pico's determination and resolve did not diminish, and even as he faced a significant period of recovery, he refused to stop chasing greatness. He attacked rehab with the same vigor as he attacked every part of his craft, doing everything possible to get back to fighting ASAP. His tenacity paid off, with Pico's return coming 7 months later in April 2023 in a decision win over James Gonzalez. That comeback win was followed by a destructive performance against Pedro Carvalho, a statement win that marked Pico's final fight under the Bellator banner before the promotion was purchased by PFL, throwing his future into sudden uncertainty. The timing couldn't really have been worse, as Pico was now finally in his prime and ready for the bigger challenges he'd long been chasing. But instead of moving forward, he was now stuck in a weird limbo. Bellator's demise hadn't come out of nowhere. For years, the promotion had taken big swings in an attempt to compete with the UFC, investing heavily in star power, marquee signings, and dabbling in homegrown prospects like Pico. But more often than not, these gambles just didn't pan out, with card after card falling flat and killing any enthusiasm around the promotion. Pico's career was emblematic of the gambles Bellator had made that hadn't translated into revenue. And though Pico had battled back and rebuilt himself into a legitimate contender, he was not the level of star needed to save the promotion that had bet so heavily on him. Now, the people who had believed in him, who'd signed him at 17, paid him before he'd even had a fight, and sold him as the future of the sport, were no longer in charge of his career. And now Pico had to sit around and wait to see what the future might look like under PFL's control. But despite the uncertainty outside the cage, his only fight in 2024 was a juicy one, as he was handed a rematch with Henry Corrales, the man who had brutally knocked him out more than 5 years ago when he was an inexperienced, overly aggressive brawler. This fight on the PFL vs Bellator card promised to be a completely different affair, with Pico a much transformed and improved fighter, while Corrales' form had been fairly middling since beating the 22-year-old version of Aaron Pico. And on fight night, the difference could not have been more pronounced, with the 2024 version of Pico controlling the fight with pressure, but educated pressure, rather than the wild aggression that Corrales had seen and exploited before. Pico won the fight across every aspect of martial arts, and he got the finish with less than 10 seconds left in the first round. It was not even remotely close between the pair. If you write the Kennedy fight off as a freak accident rather than a defeat given the injury, Pico had won 9 fights in a row while showing clear and undeniable signs of maturity in his fighting. But unfortunately, his career was to be derailed yet again, and for the second time in a row, it wasn't his fault. As mentioned earlier, Bellator had been acquired by the PFL, and the aftermath of that deal had left the Bellator roster in a strange state of flux. It was unclear whether the two brands would continue operating separately or merge entirely, but either way, the result for fighters like Pico was uncertainty, confusion, and a total lack of opportunity to fight. He wasn't alone in this either, with other big names from Bellator like Pitbull and Gegard Mousasi also finding themselves unable to get fights, reportedly due to the size of their contracts, with payouts that may have been more than PFL was willing to pay them to fight. PFL had claimed to Pico that they had fights lined up for him, and there had even been rumors of a title fight with Pitbull being on the cards, but nothing materialized, and Pico spent the rest of 2024 sat on the sidelines frustrated. Crucially though, Pico's contract with PFL expired at the end of 2024, making him a free agent, but with a major catch. Pico made no secret of the fact that he was done with the PFL and wanted to join the UFC. But crucially, PFL had matching rights, meaning that any deal Pico signed with the UFC could be matched by PFL, forcing him to stay with the promotion. This led to a Mexican standoff, with PFL threatening to match his contract, while Pico vowed that he would just sit out rather than compete in a promotion that had continually lied to him. It was a scary prospect to think Pico may have to sit out for another year just to escape PFL, but thankfully, cooler heads prevailed, and Aaron Pico officially joined the UFC in what is, in my opinion, perhaps their most exciting signing in a good few years. Despite being just 28 years old, Aaron Pico has already lived a full career's worth of highs and lows. He never came close to fulfilling the wild expectations that came with the label of the greatest prospect in MMA history. But maybe that says more about us, the fans, the media, and the promoters, than it does about Aaron Pico. Because in a sport as complex and tough as MMA, the idea that someone could find the next John Jones when they are just 17 years old is pretty ludicrous, especially given that Pico was not even competing in MMA yet by the time some were labeling him as the LeBron James of MMA. That said, Pico has become a top-level fighter, one whose best years may still be ahead of him. Beyond his elite wrestling and sharp boxing, it's his resilience and work ethic that makes him a force to be reckoned with. Even after suffering some of the most crushing losses of any top prospect, he has never shied away from the spotlight and has always kept coming back for more. And slowly but surely, Pico has earned the respect that his hype had once handed him for free. For me personally, it's impossible not to root for a guy like Pico who gives absolutely everything he has to his craft, and I think he is going to be an unbelievably fun addition to the UFC featherweight division. Plans for his debut have unfortunately fallen through, but we will see him in action later this year for the UFC in a division that has some mouth-watering potential fights for him. Aaron Pico will almost certainly not become the greatest fighter in MMA history. But his story is far from over, and there are strong reasons to believe that the most exciting chapters of the story lay ahead of him. With his form over the last few years, I think he can cause serious problems in the featherweight division and potentially contend for the title. Capturing UFC gold would be a beautiful moment for a guy who at one stage was completely and utterly written off as a hype job. I don't know how far he'll go in the UFC, but one thing is for sure. It will be entertaining, and I will most definitely be watching, as MMA's most hyped prospect ever begins his career in the world's top promotion, with winning the belt at the forefront of his mind, as it always has been. The end. Thank you so much for watching the video. Please drop a like if you enjoyed, and check out my last video on the story of MMA's most deadly fake record fraud. Subscribe to the channel if you want more videos just like this, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.